July 1944, Normandy. A narrow country road, hemmed in by towering, ancient hedgerows. 5 American M4 Sherman tanks crawl forward, their engines a low grumble in the oppressive quiet. Inside each steel hull, 5 men sweat despite the cool air. Their eyes strain against periscopes, scanning the dense, green walls for a shadow, a glint, anything. They know, in their bones, something is out there. The intelligence reports whispered it, the burnt-out wrecks along the roadside screamed it. Suddenly, a single, thunderous crack shatters the silence. A blinding flash erupts at the head of the column. The lead Sherman is violently transformed from a weapon of war into a funeral pyre, its turret lifting briefly on a jet of flame before crashing back down. The remaining 4 tanks convulse into frantic action. Turrets whine, traversing left and right, searching for a ghost. Their 75mm guns bark in panic, firing high-explosive rounds into the suspicious foliage. Clang! 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 The sound is not of detonations, but of metallic rejection. Their shells bounce harmlessly off an angled, steel behemoth materializing from the smoke and dust. It emerges not with speed, but with a terrifying, predatory confidence. A German Tiger I, its 88mm gun, long and deadly, now swings with deliberate menace toward the second Sherman. Another cataclysmic explosion. Another crew incinerated. In 3 horrific minutes, the math of the Western Front is written in fire and blood. All 5 American tanks are burning, grotesque monuments to a brutal equation. The Tiger, a monolithic victor, reverses slowly, disappearing back into the woods, unscathed, unstoppable. This was the arithmetic of terror, the 5-to-1 ratio. It took 5 Shermans to have a statistical chance against 1 Tiger. And the grim, unspoken calculus dictated that the crews of the first 4 were essentially sacrificial. The men knew it. They had a grim nickname for their own mounts. Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter whose slogan promised it, lights first time, every time. The Sherman, they lamented, shared that same flammable reliability. But here lies the tragic, infuriating secret of the European theater, it did not have to be this way. Even as those men died in the Norman Bocage, the United States possessed the answer. In 1944, American engineers had developed, tested, and perfected a new tank, the M26 Pershing. It boasted a powerful 90mm high-velocity gun capable of cracking a Tiger's armor from a mile distant. It carried heavy, sloped armor that could withstand return fire. It could have leveled the playing field, saved thousands of American lives, and rewritten the brutal math of the hedgerows. Yet, it remained sidelined. One man, perhaps more than any other, stood as the gatekeeper to its deployment, and he barred the way. General George S. Patton, Jr., the flamboyant, brilliant, and famously stubborn commander of the Third Army, looked at this technological marvel and pronounced his verdict, "I don't want it." This is the story of the great tank scandal of World War II. It is a tale of institutional dogma, of a charismatic general's potentially fatal obsession, of bureaucratic inertia, and of the terrible price paid not by strategists on maps, but by young men in steel coffins on the backroads of France and Germany. It is the story of why American tankers burned in inferior machines while a superior weapon gathered dust. To grasp the full weight of this scandal, we must first descend into the palpable fear that haunted every American armored unit, the specter of the Tiger, Tiger Phobia, the pathology of fear. Tiger Phobia was not merely slang, it was a recognized medical condition diagnosed by Army psychiatrists. It was a cocktail of justified terror, helpless rage, and shattered morale. American tankers were among the bravest soldiers of the war, but they were not fools. They knew their M4 Sherman, a fine and reliable machine in 1942, was hopelessly outclassed by 1944. The Sherman's 75mm main gun, adequate against earlier panzers, was derisively called a pea-shooter by crews facing Tigers and Panthers. Its shells would simply shatter or bounce off the thick, well-angled frontal armor of the German cats. To achieve a kill, a Sherman had to perform a near-suicidal maneuver, close to point-blank range, flank the monster, and hit its thinner side or rear armor. This required swarming tactics, throwing multiple Shermans at a single Tiger, accepting catastrophic losses in the hope that one might get a lethal shot. They were wolves trying to bring down a grizzly bear. The personal accounts are harrowing. A young tank gunner from the 3rd Armored Division wrote home, "We saw him at 100 yards, plain as day. I fired 3 rounds. Saw them spark and ricochet right off his front. I saw the German commander pop his hatch, look right at us, and laugh. Then his gun flashed. That's the last thing Jimmy and Smitty ever saw." The Sherman's vulnerability was its other curse. Its armor was insufficient against the high-velocity German guns. Worse, its ammunition was stored in vulnerable sponsons along the sides of the hull. A penetrating hit would often trigger a catastrophic ammunition fire. The Germans, with cruel accuracy, called them Tommy Cookers. The British, who shared the tank, called them Ronsons. The crews knew they had, on average, 10 seconds to escape a penetrating hit before the interior became an inferno. Many did not make it. Patton knew this. Eisenhower knew this. The War Department in Washington knew this. But the U.S. Army's official armored doctrine, shaped by pre-war theories and the influential head of Army Ground Forces, General Leslie J. McNair, was rigid. Tanks are not meant to fight other tanks. Tanks were instruments of exploitation, to break through enemy lines and wreak havoc in the rear areas. If they encountered enemy armor, they were to disengage and call for specialized, tank destroyers, fast, thinly armored vehicles with powerful guns, to handle the threat. It was a neat, theoretical solution that collapsed in the chaotic reality of Normandy. The Germans did not cooperate by keeping their tanks separate for the American tank destroyers to hunt. Their Panthers and Tigers were integral to their defensive lines, often lying in wait in those same hedgerows. The Sherman, designed for mobility and infantry support, was forced into a role it was never meant to play, head-to-head duels with dedicated German tank killers. The result was a slaughter. The super tank in waiting, the M26 Pershing. While tankers died in Normandy, the solution already existed 3,000 miles away. Since 1942, foresight engineers in the U.S. Ordnance Department had grown increasingly alarmed by intelligence on new German designs. They initiated Project T-26, a crash program to develop a heavy tank that could meet the coming threat on equal terms. The result was the M26 General Pershing. It was a generational leap. Weighing 46 tons, compared to the Sherman's 33, it was built not for lightness, but for power and protection. Its hull was cast steel, with up to 4 inches of frontal armor, sloped to deflect shots. Its turret was massive, housing the new 90mm M3 gun. This was a true tank killer, firing a heavy armor-piercing shell at 2,800 feet per second with devastating accuracy and penetration. In tests, it could punch through the frontal armor of a Panther at over 1,000 yards and challenge a Tiger on even terms. It was, finally, an American cat to fight the German ones. By early 1944, prototypes were performing superbly. The Ordnance Department, backed by reports from the field pleading for better tanks, begged for permission to rush the Pershing into production and ship it to Europe. They wanted to give their boys a fighting chance. But the U.S. military had a rigid bureaucracy. For a new tank to be adopted, it required the approval of the user, the Army Ground Forces. And the most influential, charismatic voice in that conversation belonged to General George Patton. Why Patton said, "No, the tyranny of the speed doctrine." George Patton was a cavalryman to his soul. He envisioned warfare as a dynamic, sweeping affair of movement, envelopment, and audacity. To him, the tank was not a mobile fortress, it was a mechanical horse. His philosophy was distilled into what can be called the speed doctrine. When Patton reviewed the specs for the heavy M26, he saw everything he despised. It was too heavy. It would guzzle precious gasoline. It would be slower, maxing out at around 25 miles per hour compared to the Sherman's 30+. It might get bogged down in mud or collapse the weak French bridges the lighter Shermans could cross. In Patton's eyes, the Pershing's virtues, armor and firepower, were liabilities. They encouraged a static, defensive mindset. "I don't need a tank that takes a hit," he reportedly argued. "I need a tank that avoids the hit. Tanks are not for fighting tanks, tanks are for killing infantry and creating panic in the enemy's rear." Patton was, in a sense, fighting the last war, the War of 1940, and his own sweeping campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, where fluid mobility had triumphed. He failed to fully internalize the brutal lesson of 1944. The Germans had turned the Western Front into a grinding, attritional battle where breakthrough was rare and head-on collisions were common. His doctrine required room to run. Normandy offered only labyrinthine lanes and point-blank ambushes. He made a cold, strategic calculation: America's strength was industrial output, not necessarily technical superiority. The U.S. could build Shermans, simple, reliable, and numerous, far faster than Germany could build Tigers or destroy them. If the exchange rate was 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger, so be it. America would win the war of production and attrition. It was macro strategy that made sense on a spreadsheet at headquarters. But the spreadsheet had no column for the 25 men inside those 5 Shermans. Patton, fixated on operational speed, seemed to discount the human cost of his tactical calculus. He told Ordnance, "Keep the Shermans coming. Just give me more of them." And with that, the deployment of the Pershing was delayed for critical months. The slaughter in the hedgerows, doctrine meets reality. D-Day arrived. The Americans poured into Normandy with thousands of M4 Shermans. Almost immediately, they collided with the hardened veterans of the German panzer divisions, equipped with Panthers and Tigers. The Normandy Bocage was a tanker's nightmare, a vast checkerboard of small fields surrounded by dense, earthen hedgerows topped with trees and brush. It was a defender's paradise. German tanks could lie in perfect ambush, covered from the air and from direct fire, needing only to cover a single lane. The American advantage of speed and numbers was nullified. This was a brutal, close-quarters knife fight where firepower and protection were paramount, and the Sherman had neither in sufficient measure. The reports that flooded back to Allied headquarters were desperate and consistent: "We are being slaughtered. Our guns are useless. We need a tank that can fight theirs." General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, was shaken by the horrific loss rates. In some divisions, tank battalions were chewed to pieces in weeks. Crew morale plummeted. A culture of field improvisation sprang up, field expedients. Tankers, in direct defiance of orders, welded extra steel plates, sandbags, and even spare track links to their hulls in a desperate attempt to add protection. They called it appliqué armor. When Patton saw these modified tanks, he was furious. He ordered the extra weight stripped off, claiming it strained transmissions and suspensions, reducing the very speed he cherished. He toured maintenance depots and saw the gruesome aftermath: Shermans with gaping holes, their interiors a charnel house of fused metal and human remains. Did he waver? Perhaps momentarily. But publicly and within command circles, he doubled down. The problem, he insisted, was not the tank, but the tactics. "We just need to be more aggressive, move faster, and not get bogged down." It was a refrain that rang hollow to men who had seen what an 88mm shell did to a Sherman at any speed, Belton Cooper and the testament of death traps. The human cost of this policy was documented by one man with chilling intimacy. Captain Belton Y. Cooper served as an ordnance officer with the 3rd Armored Division. His grim duty was to recover, repair, and salvage destroyed American tanks. He saw the war from its most horrific angle, the aftermath of failed armor. After the war, Cooper wrote a searing memoir titled Death Traps: The Survival of an American Armored Division in World War II. It became a controversial but seminal text. Cooper pulled no punches. The Germans were fighting a 1944 tank war. We were fighting it with a 1942 tank. I had to recover the bodies of my friends from those machines, or what was left of them. Often, it was just a small pile of ashes and a melted dog tag. Cooper laid the blame squarely at the feet of the High Command, with Patton as a prime culprit. He argued that Patton's vocal opposition to the Pershing created bureaucratic resistance that delayed its production and deployment by at least 6 critical months. In Cooper's view, had the Pershing been present in significant numbers from D-Day onward, the Normandy campaign would have been shorter, less bloody, and thousands of American tankers would have lived to see the peace. Critics and some historians contend Cooper overstated his case. They note that General McNair's obsession with the tank-destroyer concept was a bigger bureaucratic hurdle. They point out technical teething problems with the early Pershing's engine and transmission. Yet, the central fact remains: George Patton was the most famous, influential, and successful American tank commander of the war. His opinion carried colossal weight. Had he demanded the Pershing, had he clamored for it as urgently as his men clamored for survival, the bureaucratic logjam would have shattered. But he did not demand it. He rejected it. The Bulge and the ultimate reckoning. The consequences of the Sherman-only policy reached their bloody crescendo in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans unleashed their final armored reserves, including the monstrous Königstiger, King Tiger. Weighing 70 tons, with armor so thick it was virtually immune to any American tank or tank-destroyer gun from the front, the King Tiger was a rolling fortress of despair. At battles like St. Vith and the initial clashes around Bastogne, American tank units were virtually helpless. Shermans were destroyed at ranges where they could not even hope to retaliate. Crews were reduced to hiding in forests, calling in artillery and airstrikes, using their tanks as mobile pillboxes rather than as armored fighters. They could not stand and duel. Patton's famed Third Army executed a breathtaking maneuver, turning north and racing to relieve Bastogne. His belief in speed and audacity was vindicated on an operational level. The rapid move helped save the day. But the tactical cost during that relief was horrific. As the Third Army spearheads collided with German panzer units screening Bastogne, the old, brutal math reasserted itself. The lead Shermans in each column were essentially sacrificial lambs, drawing fire so that following tanks or supporting aircraft could identify and engage the enemy. The tankers knew their role. They had a new, grim nickname for themselves, zipper heads, because if a German shell hit your turret, the force could blow the hatches open and decapitate the crew. Too little, too late, the Pershing takes the stage. By January 1945, the clamor from the front, and even from the press at home, could no longer be ignored. Why were American boys dying in inferior equipment? Under intense pressure, the Army finally authorized the emergency shipment of the first M26 Pershings to Europe. A token force, barely 20 tanks, arrived in February. They were issued to the elite 3rd Armored Division. And in a handful of engagements, they demonstrated with brutal clarity what might have been, the duel at Cologne, a glimpse of an alternate history. On March 6, 1945, in the shattered city of Cologne, a U.S. Army cameraman inadvertently captured one of the most iconic and illustrative tank duels of the war. A German Panther tank, an apex predator of the European battlefield, had taken up a defensive position near the city's famous cathedral. It had already destroyed an M4 Sherman, killing its crew. As the Panther crew scanned for new targets, a strange rumbling echoed down the street. Around the corner came not another Sherman, but the low, long silhouette of an M26 Pershing, Fireball, commanded by Sergeant Robert Early. The German commander, peering through his scope, hesitated. The tank was unfamiliar, bigger, with a long gun and a distinctive silhouette. For a few critical seconds, he was confused, wondering if it was a captured German tank or something entirely new. That moment of uncertainty was a luxury the Pershing did not need. Sergeant Early's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had already acquired the target. The Pershing did not scramble for a flanking position. It did not need to. It stopped, stabilized its gun, and fired. The 90mm armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's lower glacis with catastrophic force, piercing its armor, igniting its ammunition. A secondary explosion blew the Panther's turret off its ring. The duel was over in seconds, a clean, decisive kill achieved from the front. The Pershing had dominated its opponent completely. It was the equalizer the tankers had dreamed of. When footage of the duel was shown to high command, Patton reportedly watched it with interest. His recorded reaction? No apology. No admission of error. He simply remarked, "Well, it's a good tank. But I still prefer the Sherman. It's faster." Even with irrefutable proof of its effectiveness, even after a year of carnage, Patton's obsession with the speed doctrine remained unshaken. The unanswered question, was Patton wrong? The debate rages among historians and military enthusiasts to this day. Patton's defenders argue he was strategically correct. The Pershing did have mechanical issues. Its engine was underpowered for its weight, leading to reliability concerns. More importantly, they contend that an army equipped with heavier, slower Pershings could never have executed Patton's lightning thrusts across France. They argue that the Sherman's strategic mobility, its ability to travel long distances, cross bridges, and be easily transported and maintained, was the key to the rapid advance that broke the back of the German army. Winning the war of production and movement, they say, saved more lives overall than winning individual tank duels. Patton traded lives for time and distance, and in the grand strategic picture, it worked. The critics, especially the veterans who fought in them, see it differently. To them, Patton's calculus treated tanks, and by extension, their crews, as expendable munitions. They argue that the 5-to-1 ratio was a failure of leadership and procurement, not an inevitable law of war. The Pershing, even with its flaws, would have provided a psychological and tactical boost of immeasurable value. It would have allowed American tankers to fight with confidence, not fear. It would have saved, as Belton Cooper fervently believed, thousands of specific, individual lives. They see Patton's stance not as strategic brilliance, but as a dangerous anachronism, a cavalryman's romanticism blinding him to the realities of industrialized attrition warfare. In the end, the United States won the war in Europe not because it had better tanks for most of the campaign, but because it had more tanks, overwhelming air superiority, immense material wealth, and, most of all, because it had young men of extraordinary courage. Men brave enough to climb into a machine they nicknamed a Ronson, knowing the odds, and drive it toward the deadly 88mm flash in the hedgerow. The M26 Pershing was the tank that could have changed the dynamic, that could have written a different, less bloody story for the American armored forces. Its delayed deployment stands as a poignant what-if of World War II, a case study in how doctrine, personality, and bureaucracy can intersect with deadly consequences on the battlefield. General George Patton liberated continents and became a legend. But legends are not infallible. His flaw was a refusal to adapt his core philosophy when faced with a new kind of enemy and a new kind of battle. He loved the saber charge in an era of the sledgehammer. The great tank scandal forces us to ask a difficult question: at what point does operational genius become tactical obstinacy? And what is the true cost of a general's unwavering vision, when that cost is paid in the lives of his men? The smoldering hulks in the fields of Normandy, and the quiet graves across Europe, hold their own silent answer.